Humboldt brought Dirichlet to Berlin in 1828, where he was one of the 5 or 6 who shared observational duties with Humboldt in their mapping of the actual geomagnetic shape and potential of the Earth. In 1827-28, Humboldt gave public lectures at the Singakademie Hall on physical geography, usually open to both men and women. Fanny Mendelssohn described in a letter to her friend Klingemann, "The course is infinitely interesting. Gentlemen may laugh at us as much as they will. It is wonderful in this day and age for us to have an opportunity to hear something sensible. For once I must further inform you that we are attending a second lecture series given by a foreigner on experimental physics. This course, too, is being attended mainly by women." Humboldt's investigations of the Earth were not only taught in Berlin, at Berlin's famous Friedrich Wilhelm University, established in the previous decade by his brother, Wilhelm von Humboldt, but presented again for the general public at the Singakademie. Felix Mendelssohn attended the university. Meanwhile, a collaborator of Humboldt at the university, Philipp August Beck, the great philologist, lived as a tenant in the Mendelssohn home. Years later, Felix would compose music for the staging of Beck's German translation of Sophocles' play Antigone. Humboldt also organized the Berlin Scientific Congress of August 1828, a conference that Metternich would find most dangerous. For the several weeks that Gauss stayed at Humboldt's home, they could discuss the implications of the geodetic and geomagnetic projects. Further, the representative from England, Charles Babbage, the noted promoter of Leibniz's analytic methods, expressed his delighted amazement at the culturally optimistic Mendelssohn household. It was at this time that Dirichlet entered into the Mendelssohn Youth Movement. The Mendelssohn Youth Movement. Fanny's reports on the scene in a December 27, 1828 letter to Klingemann. Christmas Eve was most animated and pleasant. You know that in our house there must always be a sort of jeune garde, young guard, and the presence of my brothers and the constant flow of young life exercise in an ever attractive influence. I must mention Dirichlet, a professor of mathematics, a very handsome and amiable man, as full of fun and spirits as a student, and very learned. Fanny's sister and Dirichlet's future wife, Rebecca, was also at that Christmas party. We may assume that some or all of the 16 Saturday night chorus were there. Fanny's longtime love, Wilhelm Hensel, back in Berlin for 2 months now, was there. He had just returned from 5 years of study of Renaissance art in Italy. Wilhelm, now 33, and a talented artist, had fought as a young man in the German liberation wars against Napoleon. Now he had returned to Berlin to win Fanny as his wife, which involved conquering Fanny's mother, Leah. A month later, the engagement was announced. Fanny also mentions 3 of the suitors of Rebecca, who would all lose out to Dirichlet. Professor Edward Gans. We see him very often, and he has a great friendship for Rebecca, upon whom he has even forced a Greek lesson, in which these 2 learned persons read Plato. It stands to reason that gossip will translate this platonic union into a real one. Gans was the Jewish student of Hegel, covered in Steve Meyer's Fidelio article on the Haskalah. Gans had been active in Jewish causes early on, but he converted in 1825 so that he could become a professor. Johann Gustav Droysen, historian and philologist, though only 19 years old, Fanny recognized in him a pure poetic spirit and a healthy, amiable mind. Droysen published a translation of Aeschylus and the famous work on Alexander the Great, both before he was 25. Heinrich Heine, poet. Heine is here. His Reisebilder contains delightful things, and though for 10 times you may be inclined to despise him, The 11th time, you cannot help confessing that he is a poet, a true poet. Once he sent, via his close friend Droysen, his greetings to the 18-year-old Rebecca. As for chubby Rebecca, yes, please greet her for me too. The dear child, she is so charming and kind, and every pound of her an angel. It seems that Heinrich Heine's brand of courtship of Rebecca was no different from his treatment of everything else in life. St. Matthew's Passion. Now, picture Dirichlet in the observation hut in the garden at 3 Leipziger Strasse. Close by is the summer house where Felix and Fanny worked, with 4 hands at the piano, the voicing and composition of Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, not performed since Bach premiered it in 1729. In January 1829, soon after Dirichlet had arrived on the scene in the Mendelssohn Youth Movement, the Bach Chorus, led by Eduard Devrient and Felix Mendelssohn, decided upon an historic March public performance, despite the discouragement of the music authorities. As described years later by Fanny's son, the appropriately named Sebastian Hensel, only just then the most intelligent musical people began to comprehend that something must be done to bring this treasure to daylight, and that this was, in a musical point of view, the greatest task of the period. After hiring a hall, with a performance 6 weeks away, the chorus swelled from 16 to 400, and the initial group had the Monge Brigade project of rapidly educating all the newcomers. Fanny described this rare and sublime process. People were speechless with admiration, and faces grew long with astonishment at the idea that such a work could have existed unbeknownst to them. Once they grasped that fact, they began studying the work with warm and veritable interest. The enthusiasm of the singers from the first rehearsal on, how they poured their heart and soul into the work, how everyone's love of this music and pleasure in performing it grew with each rehearsal, kept renewing the general wonder and astonishment. This process created so lively and detailed an interest that all the tickets were sold the day that after the announcement of the concert, and they had to refuse entrance to more than 1,000 people. At the concert itself, I was sitting in the corner of the massive chorus so as to see Felix well, and I had arranged the strongest alto voices near me. The choruses were impassioned with extraordinary strength, tempered with touching tenderness, as I had never heard them before. A peculiar spirit and general higher interest pervaded the concert, that everybody did his duty to the utmost of his powers, and many did more. And after the sublime, the ridiculous, at least one Berliner seemed to remain untouched. After the concert, at a celebratory dinner, Devrient's wife, Teresa, sat between Felix and an obnoxious professor who kept trying to get her drunk. He clutched my wide lace sleeve in an unrelenting grip to protect it, he said, and would every so often turn toward me. In short, he so plagued me with his gallantries that I leaned over to Felix and I asked, "Tell me, who is this idiot beside me?" Felix held his handkerchief over his mouth for a moment. Then he whispered, "The idiot beside you is the celebrated philosopher Hegel." Such were the circumstances of Dirichlet's first year in Berlin. Dirichlet and Rebecca Mendelssohn were engaged in 1831 and married in 1832. In Mendelssohn family discussions and debates, they were taken as the most revolutionary of the group. The couple had 4 children. Rebecca died late in 1858, age 47, evidently of a similar type of stroke that had felled her older sister, 43, and brother, 39, a decade earlier. Dirichlet's compromised health declined further, and he followed her to the grave 5 months later, May 5, 1859. Dirichlet's Republican background and Lafayette's July 1830 revolution. When he was 17, Dirichlet was sent to study in Paris, and at that time he was studying Gauss's Disquisitiones Arithmeticae. According to Sebastian Hensel, Dirichlet was introduced to General Foy by a Republican associate of Dirichlet's parents, one Larchet de Charmant. Footnote 2. Larchet is unknown to the author, since it is thought that Dirichlet's parents were active Republicans who had to leave Napoleonic France years before. It was likely that since Larchet de Charmant was a friend both of Foy and of Dirichlet's parents, they were all indeed anti-Napoleonic Republicans. Foy employed Dirichlet as a tutor in his household from the summer of 1823 until Foy's death in November 1825. Foy was in France Chamber of Deputies and was the leader of the opposition to the royalist restoration of the 1815 Congress of Vienna. Dirichlet thrived in this environment. It was very important for his whole life that General Foy's house, frequented by the first notabilities in art and science, as well as by the most illustrious members of the chambers, gave him an opportunity of looking on life in a larger field and of hearing the great political questions discussed that led to the July Revolution of 1830 and created in him such a vivid interest. Hensel's The Mendelssohn Family, Volume 1, page 312. The July Revolution of 1830 was led by Lafayette and was at best a mixed affair. It overthrew the reactionary arrangements of the Congress of Vienna and set up a tenuous arrangement whereby Louis Philippe, the citizen king, would be a constitutional monarch. Lafayette gambled that this might work, as the citizen king had pledged to be subservient to the written constitution. Two items of note reflect Foy's connections to the 1830 revolution. In October 1825, a few weeks before his death, Foy had troubled himself to write to Lafayette, and in 1823, Foy had sent from his care the 21-year-old Alexandre Dumas, the future author, then 3 years Dirichlet's senior, to be Foy's agent in the household of Louis Philippe. Later, Dumas would serve as a captain in Lafayette's National Guard in 1830. Dumas had sought Foy's guidance, as Foy himself had earlier in the 1790s looked to Dumas' father, General Alexander Davy Dumas, as his military and political leader. General Dumas was first a hero of the French army, who then became an early opponent of Napoleon's imperial ambitions. He was part of the 1798 invasion of Egypt, but was imprisoned by Napoleon from 1799 to 1801 for publicly opposing Napoleon's imperial turn. Similarly, Beethoven at this time had hopes for Napoleon that he quickly recognized were greatly mistaken. Afterwards, Napoleon's harsh treatment of General Dumas led to his early death at age 44 in 1806, when his son was only 4 years old. After Foy died in November 1825, there was a competition between Alexander Humboldt and Fourier for Dirichlet's services. Fourier, according to Hensel, tried to avail himself of Larchet de Charmant's influence to induce him, Dirichlet, to return to Paris, where he felt sure it was his vocation to occupy a high position at the Academy. Humboldt arranged for Dirichlet, then 21, to teach at Breslau, 1826 to 1828, and then brought him to Berlin in 1828, where he was the professor of mathematics at the Berlin Military Academy, and when he joined the Mendelssohn Youth Movement. Lafayette, Dumas, Gallois, Poe, and Heine. Alexander von Humboldt returned to Paris in 1830 because of the ripened political situation. Cauchy, the emperor of mathematics, had to flee Paris in July 1830 when his king was deposed. For a short period, Lafayette thought that they could control the new citizen king. However, within a few months, the financiers moved in for the upper hand in running the king, Louis Philippe. In December 1830, they succeeded in arresting the 19 leaders of Lafayette's Republican National Guard, the key defenders of the Constitution. Lafayette testified at the March 1831 trial, and the jury found them all not guilty. At the celebratory dinner for the 19 were, among others, Lafayette, Dumas, and another brilliant student of Gauss's work, Évariste Galois. The latter had been, along with Niels Abel, a victim of Cauchy's ham-handed skullduggery at the head of the French Academy of Science. At the dinner, Galois evidently made a notorious toast to Louis Philippe's health, while putting his other hand on his sword and adding that the king had better not fail in his duty to the Constitution. Dumas reports that at that point, several of the attendees, including himself, jumped out of the windows of the hall, fearing accurately that the spies at the event would bring the police. Footnote 3. Recall that Dumas is also the one who made the knowing allusion, as part of Dumas' typically factitious fiction, to Poe's stay in Paris. This is the reference that Alan Salisbury reported on years ago in his Campaigner article on Poe. Galois was arrested, tried, and released when the jury refused to convict him. He was rearrested that summer 1831 by the police prefect Guisset for wearing a Republican Guard uniform in public. Guisset avoided the unsuccessful trials and instead kept him in jail until the next spring, when his release and the setup of his fatal duel fell hard one upon the other. When Galois' suspicious death roused a crowd to come out to his funeral and a public accounting was threatened, Guisset carried out the night before the funeral a preemptive arrest of Galois' friends. Which of these events in Galois' last year, 1831 to 1832, were attended by Edgar Allan Poe is unclear, but clearly Poe's The Purloined Letter skewers Guisset, the perfect G, and by inference celebrates the poet-mathematician, Galois. While Poe does also refer, and explicitly, to the mathematician Charles-Auguste Dupin, the historical figure that literally was a member of the Monge Brigade, having been taught by Monge, Poe's poet-mathematician image does not need to be reduced to one individual. However, the politically sensitive case of Galois at the time of Poe's visit to Paris and the reference to the prefect G makes it clear that the Galois case would have been understood by astute readers of Poe's time. Regardless, Poe's poet-mathematician image would appropriately apply to any of the leading 1820s students of Gauss, Galois, Abel, or Dirichlet. Finally, Heine, upon the news of the July Revolution, decided to leave Berlin for Paris. He would have been there with Alexander von Humboldt during these events. His early work in Paris during this period is reflected in his The Romantic School, where he diagnosed for the French and the Germans the evil medievalism of the cultural string pullers that had deliberately set out to murder the Germany of Moses Mendelssohn, Lessing, and Schiller. No successful European revolution could proceed without dealing with these skeletons, and none did. The rapid sketch above is only a beginning suggestion as to the interplay of Gauss's disquisitiones arithmeticae, the healthy benefits of opposing evil, example, the imperial beastman Napoleon, the children and grandchildren both of Moses Mendelssohn and of the American Revolution in Europe, and the passion of magnetic measurements and the revival of Bach's St. Matthew's Passion. Much more can and should be covered in this specific period, regarding the activities of J.F. Cooper, J.Q. Adams, Lafayette, Poe, etc., but this abbreviated historic sketch centered around Dirichlet should take us back to the Gauss-Dirichlet-Riemann dialogue, somewhat refreshed.